everyone for joining us and welcome. My name is Meg Sheehan. Welcome to the webinar co-hosted by Community Land and Water Coalition and Mass Audubon. We are recording this on Zoom and on Facebook Live, and we'll be taking about an hour and a half for the presentation with Q&A in the last half hour and also throughout the meeting. So the Community Land and Water Coalition is a network of groups and individuals based in Plymouth County and connected statewide. Our mission is to preserve, protect, and steward our finite land and natural resources because we're losing them fast. And here in Massachusetts, the southeastern area is really under threat in Plymouth County from industrial sand mining, extraction, stripping forests and soils, from for extraction and also for land-based solar. The cranberry industry has taken a great toll on our lands and waters as well. And we are facing the extinction of some of our rare species here. We're a globally rare habitat, the coastal plain pine barrens, and we're losing what took 11,000 years to build our soils since the time of the glacier that support our rare pine barrens forests. This is a very timely webinar, and we're really thrilled to have Heidi Ricci from Mass Audubon to talk to us about conservation planning and what we can do and how we can get involved. In the meantime, we want to ask you to save the date for Saturday, July 31st from 1 to 4 p.m. We'll be having a statewide rally honoring the earth and getting together and having educational opportunities and speakers. One of our focuses will be no clear cutting for land-based solar energy. You'll get to hear from Indigenous leaders about honoring the land, from local leaders about the impacts of large solar in their towns, and you'll hear from experts about forest and water impacts. We will be co-hosting that with our allies in Western Massachusetts, Save Massachusetts Forests, and there will be simultaneous events in the town of Wareham and in the town of Greenfield. So save the date and you'll be hearing more from us about that. With no further ado, I will turn it over to Heidi.
Thank you so much, Meg, and thank you and everyone you've been working with there in the region to protect these globally important resources. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my computer set here. So I'm going to start my presentation. So I hope you're all able to see that.
Yes, do you want to do full screen? That might make it, there you go.
Okay, thanks. Great. Yeah, so thank you again to the Community Land and Water Coalition for everything you're doing and for inviting me to come and talk tonight. I've divided the conversation up into several different sections. I'm going to give some regional context as well as information about the different values of the ecosystem services values of nature, and then some opportunities for how people can get involved, particularly at the local level, and advocate for protection. And I'm going to stop at several points throughout the presentation and offer the opportunity for Meg to moderate some Q&A, because there's a lot of material, and I think it's good to break it up a little bit. So first, I hope most of you are probably familiar with Mass Audubon, but we are one of the oldest and the largest conservation organization in New England. We were founded by a couple of visionary women in 1896 to protect the indiscriminate slaughter of birds. and have since grown into a broader environmental organization doing direct conservation, education, and advocacy. We have 135,000 members, 38,000 acres of land, and 22 sites with staff nature centers. And we're so pleased to be able to be opening things back up. Our sites are now open again to the public, although some still, I might have restrictions on like asking people to pre-register or something. But I encourage you to go to our website, check it out, and come see our sanctuaries. We have a brand new action agenda, which we just announced very recently. And there are 3 major goals components to this, and they're all interrelated. So protecting land is first and foremost the #1 priority, protecting resilient lands in the context of climate change. So we have embraced the Biden agenda, the 30 by 30 of land protection, 30% of the land by 2030, but we've upped that a notch. So here in Massachusetts, we already have 27% of the land statewide protected, although in your region there, it's much lower than that. And so we have a goal of by 2026, 30% of Massachusetts will be protected. It's really important to be inclusive and for everyone to have equitable access of nature across all of our communities, all across the state. So we're going to have a really intense focus on that. And then, of course, climate change is the biggest issue facing us, and we need to tackle that in a very serious way, supporting the goal of no net loss. No net emissions by 2050. As well as no net loss of land and the function of land in supporting both climate mitigation and resilience. So these things are obviously interrelated. There's a role of land in climate action. You need to engage all people in mobilizing on these things, etc. Local action is particularly important. Massachusetts being a home rule state, very strong home rule, where local governments really play the major decision-making role in what happens with land use. And most of the smaller to mid-sized communities that are facing the biggest development pressures are run primarily by citizen volunteers. If they have professional staff, it's often minimal and tends to get overwhelmed with dealing with issuing permits for development applications and not having enough time and resources to do the advanced planning and the updating of local bylaws and rules that's really needed. So local support and involvement of local residents in their local government is really key to conservation and more sustainable development. So as Meg noted, you're living in a really very special region in a special state, but a globally significant region. The Taunton watershed, which you're just on the border of, is the Taunton River is the longest undammed river in all of New England. And there's also been a lot of work removing dams along many of the tributaries. So it's, one of the most important anadromous fish runs, but it's got a lot of other really important characteristics. There are important bird areas, critical environmental concern areas, but really the habitats that rely on this coastal plain geology that formed from the glacial retreat 11,000 years ago, as Meg mentioned. It's that sand and gravel that underlies everything in the region. The glacial kettle holes that were created by the blocks of ice that remained behind as the ice melted away. Those are really critical habitats, and they're windows into the lens of the sole source aquifer that you all rely on for your water supplies, and that is the basis for the stream flow in all the rivers and streams. So here is a map from the State Wildlife Action Plan that shows roughly where the pitch pine oak forests are in Massachusetts. I know that the the Southeast Pine Barrens Alliance has been working on much more fine-tuned mapping than this as well. If you're not already involved with them, I encourage you to do so. So what does this all mean? The state Mass Wildlife has produced a document called Biomap 2, and they're actually in the process of updating that now. There's going to be a Biomap 3 probably out next year, which looked at all of the land and the habitats all across the state and identified the ones that were most intact and most diverse and most important for protecting our native species and ecology going forward. And as this quote says, the pitch pine, scrub oak barrens and the coastal plain ponds in your region there in Plymouth, Carver, Wareham, and Bourne are the most important area for biodiversity in the entire state. And this includes globally rare species like the northern red-bellied cooter, which is a federally endangered species, and a lot of effort has been put into restoring that species. There's a wide range of other species, plants, insects, birds. I put the towhee on here because it's a declining species. So in addition to the species that are state listed, like these, the Pine Barrens beetle, the Barrens buck moth, the Pine Barrens bluet, and the Plymouth gentian, there are a lot of other species in your region as well that are in serious decline and that depend on that Pine Barrens habitat. And I just love towhees. I think they're some of the most extraordinary birds. So in the context of all of those important resources, I first just want to pause before I dive into losing ground and what we found in terms of land use trends, to see if Meg or anyone else from the coalition leadership has anything to add to what I said about the context of the region. And if not, that's fine, I can continue.
No, thank you for touching on the fact that we have this precious sand and gravel that protects our sole source aquifer. And that really is one of the biggest threats right now. We really have absolutely no idea how much of that has been removed by sand and gravel mining. So we really need to get a handle on that so we can do what we can to protect our aquifer.
Great. That's really important.
So I would just also add, this is Brian, I would just also add that it's a globally rare ecosystem. It's not just, state importance, it's of global importance.
Absolutely. Yep. Yes. And so in that context, what is that juxtaposed with? Well, every 5 years or so, Mass Audubon does an analysis of the rate and the pace and the patterns of land development and conservation across the state. And we call that report Losing Ground. The most recent edition, the 6th edition, was published in February 2020 with a subtitle, Nature's Value in a Changing Climate. And we found a continuation of a troubling trend where this part of the state is among the most rapidly developing part of the state. So while 60% of the land here is still not developed, only 19% of it is protected. And so you're faced with this confluence of these really important, sensitive lands and tremendous development pressure. And that comes not only from the cranberry bogs, which are under really serious financial pressures and competing, but also just Southern New England in general. There's so much development, so much pressure for housing and other kinds of development. So doing proactive planning now in the communities and then putting in place updated bylaws and regulations to make sure that those plans will be implemented is really vital going forward. So what's the value of nature? I think we all have a sense of the intrinsic values. We appreciate the beauty, the plants and animals and the birds and just the peaceful sense that we get when we're out in nature. But oftentimes that's not enough to really motivate local officials. They may be more concerned about balancing the town's budget and bringing in revenue and jobs and the like. So we undertook a project looking at over 100 technical articles on ecosystem services valuation and digested all that information and made it available for advocates to use with their local officials in making the case for why there's actual true economic value to nature as well as its intrinsic value. So here are some of the values that can be considered. Of course, forests sequester and store carbon. They clean our air and water. They recharge our water supplies. They provide not just forests, but farmlands as well, food and fiber that we need in our lives. With climate change, we have more intense storms happening. So having a forested or vegetated landscape is really important to absorb that water and allow it to slowly filter back into the land instead of running off. It provides habitat for a wide variety of species, recreation. I think with the pandemic, there's been a tremendous upsurge in interest in the out of doors and a much greater recognition of the fact that getting outdoors can actually improve people's not only physical health, but also mental health. And there have also been studies showing that natural lands, particularly protected lands, increase property values and of course, overall quality of life. As just one example, about 7% of the annual greenhouse gas emissions emitted in Massachusetts are offset by the forests and other natural parts of our landscape reabsorbing that carbon and storing it in the plants. In terms of flooding, there was a study done after Hurricane Sandy that found that the communities in New Jersey that had natural vegetated wetlands remaining in place suffered far less damage than the communities that had allowed development to encroach on those areas. And they quantified that as $625 million in prevented losses during that storm. There's been a great deal of recognition of the value of natural land for water supplies, and Massachusetts has spent a lot of money helping cities and towns buy land for water supply protection. As with so many other things, nature provides, natural functions that don't require ongoing maintenance of hard infrastructure like a water treatment plant. The Quabbin water supply, for example, avoided having to build a filtration plant because so much of the land was protected. And then pollinators. I mean, there's a lot of talk about honeybees, but here in Massachusetts, we have over 300 species of native bees. And there are also probably thousands of other native insect pollinators, beetles, and the like, as well as birds and other wild pollinators. And we rely on this for a large part of our locally produced food, as well as just, the integrity of nature and enabling plants to continue to reproduce and to provide food for other animals. So we've digested all this information into 5 fact sheets on the different habitat types and addressing climate and the other values within each of them. These are available on our website under Value of Nature at Mass Audubon. So I encourage you to check them out, download them, share them. And I think I'm gonna pause there as well in case anybody has any questions about ecosystem services. And if not, I can move on. I'm not able to look at the chat easily, so Let me know if anything comes up by the next pause. Okay, so now kind of transitioning into this whole concept of green infrastructure. So gray infrastructure is our roads, our bridges, our water supply systems, our wastewater treatment systems, our seawalls, stormwater drainage systems, etc. Green infrastructure is letting nature do the work for us. So that includes natural areas like forests and wetlands, but it also includes using vegetation and soils within development sites. So there's a big trend towards using green infrastructure, and also terminology often associated with that is low impact development, building rain gardens and vegetated swales and planting more trees and minimizing the amount of disturbance within development sites, trying to preserve more trees. A lot of communities are adopting bylaws that minimize the amount of clearing and grading that can occur when development does happen. Recognizing again that these services are provided free, they don't require a lot of maintenance. Certainly the rain gardens and the swales do require some maintenance, but the traditional stormwater systems like detention ponds are supposed to be maintained as well, and they often aren't. And then they become mosquito breeding areas. I know there's always a lot of concern in southeastern Massachusetts about EEE, Eastern Equine Encephalitis. Well, the mosquito that's believed to be the primary vector that transmits the disease between birds, which are the normal host, to people, is a mosquito called the cattail mosquito that lives in cattails. And there are a lot of cattails in these detention ponds. So when we build developments and we build them with closed drainage systems, catch basins that can also breed mosquitoes, and then detention ponds with cattails in them, we're setting ourselves up for a public health issue that can be easily avoided by doing more of this kind of green infrastructure type drainage. The water does not stay in these systems for more than 72 hours and they cannot breed mosquitoes. So it has a lot of water quality benefits as well, but the mosquito issue is often overlooked. In Losing Ground, we mapped the natural green infrastructure, the parts of our landscape that are still in a natural condition and that are most important for supporting those values of nature that I talked about. And we found that in doing this mapping that about 40% of those lands are already protected and 60% are unprotected. So what we're suggesting is that in the future, we would like to see most of the new development go into the sort of the white areas on this map through infill and development in less sensitive areas, and that most of the land protection should go into that unprotected green infrastructure. And this slide just explains a little bit more how we developed that green infrastructure map. We partnered with Manomet on this and did it first in the Taunton watershed, and then we prepared a map statewide based on the same methodology. So what we did is the Nature Conservancy has developed pretty fine-grained, detailed maps of all the lands that are most important for biodiversity across not just Massachusetts, but the entire Northeast and down into the Mid-Atlantic. And so these are the places where there's large blocks of forests that are connected, not divided by roads, or where there's a representative natural community that is of particular high quality. And then there's also the Biomap 2 maps from the state, which I mentioned, that have some similar characteristics, but are a bit broader and also include sort of surrounding natural landscape areas that are important for this overall integrity of the land. And then we overlaid on top of that some water resources related data layers. So surface waters, wetlands, floodplains, lands in close proximity to those areas. And once you combined all of those, that is what generated the green infrastructure map statewide that you saw just a few minutes ago. So we have this information statewide, and we can also make it available to you in GIS format for your community if you wish to play with it or overlay it with other data layers. This is the map for Wareham, and about half of the town, it falls within the Green Infrastructure Network, but only about a quarter of that network is currently protected. So this, we suggest this is a planning tool that communities can use to plan where should their priorities for open space protection be, where should their priorities be for development. And of course, there's other information that needs to flow into that, but this is a starting point. So I think I'll just pause again for a moment in case anybody has any questions about the Green Infrastructure Network, because it is a little bit of a technical analysis. Sometimes people want to know more about how that was developed or what it means.
Sure, this is Meg. I would ask, what's the connection between the Nature Conservancy's maps and biomap, the biomap system that the state uses?
The Nature Conservancy resiliency maps were part of an early version of that, was part of what the state considered, and they're considering that again in the update. But the biomap also includes other information from the Natural Heritage Database, for example, certified and potential vernal pools, and known sites of rare species, and what the habitat needs of those species are. So it includes some additional information.
And what would be the easiest way for people to access that information if they're working on a campaign?
The Green Infrastructure Network map, or
Yes.
the you can request that from us and we can get it to you
Okay.
again. It's in GIS format, but we can provide
Okay.
that. And if
Okay.
you have somebody who can use GIS, you should be able to utilize it. And we can provide
Okay.
with it, there's a technical document that explains how it was put together.
So I'm also wondering what kind of, is there an outreach program to community planning boards, to town planning boards?
We do have a community resilience coordinator, Danica Warrens, who works out of our Oak Knoll office in Attleboro. And she is available in the region to provide support and advice. And we have a lot of information also available on our website, massaudubon.org/shapingthefuture. We had been doing a lot of sort of in-person workshops for a long time. And then with the pandemic that stopped, but we continue to do webinars like this one. As we transition to implementing the new action agenda and getting back to real life in-person stuff, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do more of this work, like through our sanctuaries, using the tools that we have. But for now, you have Danica in your region and you can reach out to her as well as me.
And Heidi, a quick question just for clarification on something you had said earlier about what % of Massachusetts is protected. You had said 27 and the goal was 30% by 2026, but then you showed a slide recently about 40% is protected. And I was wondering if you can help me understand those two numbers.
Sure. So the 27% is of the total land mass, the 5 million plus change acres. The 40% is of just the Green Infrastructure Network. So that shows you actually that the state and the municipalities have done a pretty good job, because the percentage of the Green Infrastructure Network that is protected is higher than the percentage of the sort of the total land across the state.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Heidi, can you tell me when this was generated? These
the
maps?
green infrastructure network map.
Yes.
Believe that's based on 2019 data. But there may be a lag in there, and you may be seeing some green blobs on here that are now developed.
Yes, I'm sure.
Or
Yeah.
you might be seeing some light green blobs that have since been protected and should be dark green.
Okay.
And had you said how many acres the green infrastructure network is?
Oh boy, I'd have to look that up to remember for sure. I think it's about 2 million acres
Wow.
total, but don't hold me to that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll proceed. So back to losing ground and sprawling development. And you can see here what we call the sprawl frontier is the towns that are in the darker red colors. In the southeast Mass is lit up, as well as sort of the 495 belt and even beyond that and into the southern Connecticut Valley. So these are the areas where development is occurring most rapidly. There's the most, when we normalize the data, so it's the most development per square mile per community. And we have a lot of other information that's available on the Losing Ground page of our website. So it's not just the report and a summary of a report, but we also have statistics and maps. And you can access that information and then filter it either by municipality, by county, by watershed, or by regional planning agency. And this is an example of doing that. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to move this little thing off my screen so I can see the data. So for example, here you can see Carver lights up as more than 10 acres per square mile of per square mile of the town. So that's the rate of development during the study time period. And Plymouth and Wareham are also in the pretty high rate. I believe Carver was the number 3 most rapidly developing community in the state.
Wow.
Wareham was 6th. Plymouth is up there too. And then we also have rates of conserved land. So newly developed land, percent developed, percent open. So overall percent permanently conserved was 16%. Over 1,000 acres was protected between 2012 and 2019. But that still only ranks number 38 out of 351 cities and towns. So trying to catch up, a lot of ways to go. And this data is available for each community, but it can also be done on a watershed basis or a county basis. So where do we go from here? How can we think about the future, visualize it? One of the tools for that is this. This is from Harvard Forest. They did a New England-wide New England Landscape Futures Scenarios analysis. And they took recent trends data in land use and then also modeled out 4 other different scenarios. And I'll give you the website for this in the next slide. But the different scenarios result in different build outs and different patterns of land conservation through the year 2060. And nobody's saying any one of these is definitely what's going to happen. But based on certain assumptions, it's likely that development patterns will go in certain directions. So in the upper left, you have a scenario called connected communities, where people really appreciate the value of the natural land. They try to work with that. They try to base their economy around protecting and utilizing those resources in a sustainable way and doing compact development around existing town centers and existing infrastructure. And then really accelerating the pace of conservation in the most important areas. And so when you compare that with the one on the lower right, which is growing global, there you have a tremendous influx of population from climate refugees from other parts of the country and the world. You have uncontrolled, unplanned development just allowed to proceed wherever anybody decides they want to do it. And a much more sort of global basis of getting our goods and food and everything from all around the world without thinking about our local resources. So you can see there's a very different outcome. And then the other two scenarios have some other assumptions and sort of intermediate results. But what's really cool about this tool is that they have an interactive map with a slider, and you can put any two of the scenarios on the left and the right, and then you can slide back and forth and you can zoom in and out, and you can go right into a local area and see what the projected trend is based on those assumptions. And this can really be utilized to engage folks in your community in some conversations about where are things headed. People often don't think about like where things are going to go until they see it happening. They see the bulldozers and they get really upset and they want to stop it, and it's often too late. Or just incremental changes over time, and they don't really see the cumulative impacts until decades on. So again, this isn't saying this is definitely what's going to happen under any particular set of assumptions, but it's a great tool for people to zoom in and say, you know, find the area that you care about and what's going to happen to it under these different scenarios, and what might we do to change course if that's not what you want to see happen. And then in addition to the maps, you can click on these different areas and you can get statistics, and it will tell you how much forest or floodplain or farmlands is developed or protected within different areas based on the different scenarios. So it's a pretty cool tool, and they have a really nice story map that goes along with it as well. I encourage people to use it. So what's going to happen if we just continue with this sprawling development without good planning and without strong local land use regulations? I'm going to present some basic information on this. Some of this may be, you know, familiar to folks who know a little bit about land use planning, but for others, maybe it's new or a refresher. So with our natural landscapes, the plants and the soils play a really important role. About half of the precipitation that lands on the land gets absorbed into the soils. About a quarter of it at least goes down into deep infiltration to recharge the aquifer. And only 10% of that precipitation is runoff. When we develop land intensively with a lot of impervious, a lot of impervious surfaces, it really upsets this whole hydrologic cycle. And you have a tremendous loss of infiltration and a great increase in the amount of runoff. So the rain and the snow melt is essentially lost to the system. And it also creates a great deal of pollution from stormwater and accelerates erosion. So with climate change, we're even more concerned about this, because with climate change, what we're seeing in our region, and there's some regions like the Southwest that are seeing a decrease in precipitation overall. In the Northeast, we're actually seeing an increase in total precipitation, but it's much more irregular. it's coming in big buckets. We get these storms where we get 3 or 4 inches all at once in an hour sometimes. And then we get more frequent droughts as well, where there's long periods of time where we get almost nothing. We've had 2 major droughts just in the last few years, and we're entering another drought again now, possibly this year. So this creates flooding and stormwater and water quality problems. There's also issues, of course, with increased temperature, with climate change. We've already seen a number of 90-degree days this year, and it's still June. This stresses both people and the natural environment, things like fisheries. And all of that is compounded when we build a lot of impervious surfaces, because the water runs off much more quickly, and it's heated up on those impervious surfaces and contributes to the warming of the water and also of the air and urban heat islands and public health and all of that. So this gets back to, you know, the value of nature and appreciating the role of nature in our built environment. So development is going to happen. We need houses, we need jobs, but we can do it much better than we've been doing. And this is one example of a sort of a pocket cottage style development that Horsley Witten designed. You can see these homes, they don't have individual driveways. They share a common parking space that's close to the houses. And the houses are close together, but they're super insulated so they don't get noise. They're nicely designed, and everybody has their own private garden, small yard, but without like acres and acres of lawn that need to be artificially irrigated. This also encourages more of a sense of community because people walk around and get to know their neighbors. There's usually a common area where they can congregate, gather together. So there are a lot of benefits to this style of development, but in many communities, building this way is not permitted under local bylaws and regulations. So in relying on nature, we need to work with it in all aspects. So we need to conserve those remaining intact, most important parts of our natural green infrastructure. We need to integrate nature and natural features within design whenever we do development and redevelopment. And then we also need to restore resilience where it's been degraded. It's not going to be enough anymore to protect what we still have. We're going to have to repair some of the damage that's been done. So I think I'm going to again stop there in case there's any questions before we go into this other segment.
Heidi, I just asked the question in the chat about why that wouldn't be possible. Is it because it's smaller than a quarter acre or something like that, and they'd have to redo their zoning bylaws?
Yes, it would have to do with both zoning bylaws and subdivision rules and regulations. So there's typically standards for both lot size, frontage, setbacks, front and side and rear setbacks. There typically is a requirement that every unit has to have frontage on a public way. And so even the concept of allowing some residential development to proceed like that, where you just have the walkways. Now there's the question, how do you get emergency access for fire and you know, other public safety vehicles? Well, sometimes these developments like that one, or there's another one in West Concord called the River Walk. There's a path, a cart path at the River Walk that it goes behind some of these buildings, and it can accommodate a fire truck or an ambulance or whatever. So there are other ways, but it's unpaved and it's not used on a regular basis for vehicles. So there are ways to provide the public safety access without needing to have these big long driveways leading up to every house. And you don't have to have 50 feet of setback that's all cleared and graded and made into a monoculture lawn. You know, so, and we have a bylaw review tool that shows communities how they can evaluate their current rules and regulations, and then modify them.
Nice, thank you.
There is another question in the chat too from Arena. Are there any maps that differentiate between different types of development?
I'm
This
not sure,
question
like
is-
distinguishing these kinds of development from additional
Sorry,
kinds.
this question was more pertaining to your earlier maps that you were showing of Carver, and Carver being the most developed within the region. And I was just wondering if there's any more specific maps that you know of that shows, the type of development.
Not really. The state has a land use classification mapping system in the Mass GIS with data layers that sort of tease out more like, is it low intensity residential versus high intensity residential versus commercial industrial, or really urbanized. So, there's some information like that, but that won't really tell you what the underlying zoning is. Unfortunately, there's no centralized repository where you can find all the zoning in the state. This is something I've wanted for years, to know like what communities have adopted the best practices so that we can learn from them and copy them. There's a real need for that. We don't have a state office of planning. There's some gaps at the state level.
Thank you.
Sure. Your regional planning agency is a resource though, and they often know like different communities who has some best practices and who they've worked with recently to do updates. So that's a place to go for a resource for that. Okay. So local government, how does it work? Maybe you all know this, I don't know, but I present it and hopefully it'll be of some use to get you thinking about getting engaged with your local government. So there are 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. 50 of them are cities. And the city council or the town meeting are considered the local legislative body. So those are the entities that approve zoning bylaw amendments and other bylaw or ordinance amendments. The select board or town manager or the mayor would make more sort of day-to-day administrative decisions. The city councils and town meetings also appropriate funds, whether that's the annual budget or things like if you have the Community Preservation Act and want to approve funding for a project under that, then it goes to town meeting. Some communities have representative town meeting. I think maybe Plymouth might. But most communities have open town meeting where everyone can go and speak up and vote. And then we have our boards and commissions. And as I said earlier, most of these they're typically volunteer citizens, and they might be elected or they might be appointed by the selectmen. But they make really important decisions, and they don't always have professional staff to help them out in doing that work, which is pretty complicated and technical and time consuming. So planning boards are responsible for creating and updating master plans. Conservation commissions typically take the lead on open space plans, but they're also responsible for all wetlands permitting and managing municipal conservation lands usually. Zoning boards review, it varies from community to community, but they often review things like variances and special permits, 40B projects, etc. Most recommendations for zoning changes are made by planning boards. They can be made by a citizen petition, but I don't really recommend that because it doesn't usually go anywhere. Usually it's more effective to get the planning board and other boards on board that, hey, we need to update our zoning, and then sometimes they'll establish like a special bylaw review committee or hire a consultant to work with the boards to help them with that. one of the big issues with local government is the need to break down the silos between the boards, which is particularly difficult when you have a situation where you don't have professional staff. And so again, these volunteers, they're going to meetings and having to review, permit applications and deal with kind of things that are right in front of them, and finding that time to sit down and meet with their, corresponding folks from other boards, and to do that in a way that complies with the open meeting law, or to undertake special projects like bylaw review. It can be difficult, but we really encourage a sort of one-on-one, like building some relationships. If you do have staff in town hall, asking that there be interdepartmental like staff meetings on a regular basis and processes for coordination. The other thing that happens, oftentimes we've seen this in our bylaw reviews, is that the one set of rules and regulations won't align with another. So community might have adopted a very strong local wetlands bylaw that says you can't develop within X number of feet of a wetland. But the zoning bylaw is written in such a way where, you have to have X amount of land per housing unit, and there's no flexibility really to do like clustered or open space design development. And then the subdivision rules and regs require excessively wide roads with huge right of ways associated with the roads, and these setbacks and things we were talking about before. And so you can't really do the buffer zone setback because the developers are like, oh, but I need to develop every square inch of my upland in order to meet the zoning requirements. So this is where our bylaw review, we try to bring things into alignment and say, let's focus the development in the least sensitive areas. Let's minimize the amount of imperviousness, minimize the amount of clearing and grading, but still get the same amount of housing at the end of the day, but have less roadway to maintain, have less piping to maintain, etc. The other thing, of course, to be aware of is the laws that apply to the operation of these boards. I mentioned open meeting law here. There's also a conflict of interest law. So members of boards and commissions aren't supposed to be doing things that are self-dealing, and recuse themselves if they or the close family members have an interest in it. But so all meetings have to be open to the public. They have to be advertised in advance. There have been, under the pandemic, as you probably know, that was all loosened, and boards were allowed to meet virtually. And this has really actually been a big benefit for public participation, because a lot of people who couldn't get to meetings in person, their busy lives, they're getting home from work, they may have families to take care of, and then after a long day of work, getting in the car, driving off to town hall and sitting through a 2 or 3 hour meeting to hear the one segment on the topic that you cared about. A lot of people just wouldn't do it. But with virtual Zoom town meetings of these boards, people can tune in, they can watch, they can observe. It gives a lot more transparency to what's going on in government. And they can do it, in their own home on their own time. So those provisions were extended recently by the legislature through April of next year. And the hope is that at least some form of that will be extended. It may be that the boards themselves at some point will need to be there in person, but I really hope that they will allow the public to continue to view and hopefully participate via Zoom, at least as a local option to do that. It's important to distinguish between public meetings and public hearings. There's often confusion on that. If it's just a public meeting, there's no requirement for a board or a committee to allow the public to speak. But there may be other ways that you could communicate if you have interests or concerns. You could reach out ahead of time and ask to get on the agenda on a particular topic. You can, write an email or a letter to the board. You can, if they do have staff, you can go in and talk to the staff. If they don't have staff, maybe talk to the chairperson. But sometimes people show up at a public meeting of a board thinking they're going to be able to raise their hand and speak, and they're frustrated when they can't, because there's no requirement to allow that. A public hearing is different. There usually are provisions for public input at a public hearing, although the exact rules for how that's conducted varies. But at a minimum, you can normally submit comments to get on the record before the hearing is closed on any kind of a permit. So here are some of the key things to get involved in. The master planning and open space plans to include the green infrastructure network, and to prioritize those for protection and prioritize development away from those areas. Climate action and resiliency plans, like through the municipal vulnerability preparedness program, and then implementing those plans with action grants or other grants that are becoming available. The governor recently proposed significant increases to some of those funding, as well as funding for land protection. So hopefully there's going to be more money available. I don't know, I should have looked at the map, but do you guys all have Community Preservation Act yet? I don't know if Meg knows of the 3 communities, but that's a,
Yes.
yes, good. It's a fabulous tool, and it not only protects open space, but allows for historic preservation. A lot of communities have also used it to do things like renovate historic buildings. And then the bylaw review, which I mentioned, and we have our bylaw review tool. So this is where we were talking about, is your zoning map in harmony with the green infrastructure map? What are your requirements for development and protecting nature? At the bottom of this slide here is the link to our bylaw review tool, and we have a little introductory webinar recording on there, as well as other related information and fact sheets about all of this. Here are some of the programs that I mentioned, and there are many others, and some of those are listed on our website as well. So before I run out of time here, I just want to, let's see, we're doing all right. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the findings of losing ground, in particular in relation to solar. So when we did the most recent edition of Losing Ground, which studied the development period 2012 through 2017, we found almost 25,000 acres of land had been developed across the state during that time, which translates to a rate of 13.5 acres per day. And looking down below, you can see what the rate was in previous editions. And, it's nice because it's gone way down since we started doing this back in the late 1980s, when it was 40 acres per day. We've gotten the rate of development way down, and also the rate of conservation is way up. It's up to like around 50 acres per day now statewide. So we've made a lot of progress. But what we discovered as well was that about a quarter of all this new development, or 6,000 or so acres we estimated, was large-scale ground-mounted solar. And if it was not for, if that new form of development had not come onto the scene, then the rate of development would have dropped to about 10 acres per day. So this is very significant, and it's just the beginning of a whole trend here, because we do need the solar development. There's no question about that, but the question is, where is it going to go? And here's what we've been seeing. This is Primfield prior to the study period, and there's a 50-acre solar development. And so we wanted to know, like, how much of this is happening and where, and what kinds of land are being converted. So we partnered with John Rogan, professor at Clark University, and some of his GIS graduate students. And there was a whole team of them that have worked on this over the last couple of years, along with some outside advisors. So I really thank them for their efforts. And they used satellite photos, GIS, and some advanced machine learning techniques, and they identified solar array, large-scale solar arrays all across the state and mapped them, as well as the land area around the solar array that was altered. And oftentimes there's other clearing associated with it, for example. And they now have statewide maps for this for both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And for Massachusetts, what they found was that it was 7,700 acres in, I think, 700 different developments that they identified, which was higher than the 6,000 that we did, which was a rough estimate. And we were very conservative because we didn't want to like overestimate, given that we didn't have fine grained data at that time. So it confirmed, you know, it's not only at least what we said it was actually a lot more. And about half of that was formerly forested land. And we want to see a lot more of this. This is a large parking lot in Framingham before and after, and there are some large parking lot solar canopies. But why is not more of this happening? Well, there are a number of reasons. There are technical, financial, administrative, legal barriers. And again, zoning comes into play, not just zoning, but site plan review rules come into play. Communities, oftentimes it's not real easy or simple for people to get these kinds of projects permitted. So we've been working really hard trying to get the state to revise their financial incentives to exclude large new projects in the biomap lands and priority habitat for rare species. And also there's been a lot of effort to get local communities to update their zoning, to do things like restrict the size of the solar arrays or to restrict them to only certain districts. But there's been a lot of pushback on both ends. So there's some big loopholes to the new restrictions on the financial incentive eligibility. There's one for public entity projects. So some developers have been partnering with municipalities. And if they do that, then they can get around this prohibition on doing it in those sensitive areas. And then some of the local bylaws that have been passed have been challenged in land court and challenged successfully, because there's a provision in the State Zoning Act that says that the communities shall not unreasonably regulate solar, and land court is interpreting that pretty broadly and saying, no, you can't prohibit them, you know, on a district basis. It has to be more on a site specific or other criteria basis related to the public interest. So all this is really of a concern. We need a statewide plan. We might need changes to the Zoning Act, which is going to be really difficult to do. We've been looking at like how much land could be lost if this trend continues. And based on an estimate of needing 50 gigawatts of solar power into the future, that could translate to another 150,000 acres of land loss if the current trends continue. So that's really serious stuff. We're pushing for a plan, and if the state's not going to do it, maybe we'll find a way to do it. A geospatial plan, identify first what are the target goals, not just to 2050, but some interim goals like 2030, 2035, etc. There's over 1 million acres of land already developed in the state. Let's do some analysis of how much of that is rooftops, parking lots, brownfields, and where it's suitable. There has been some analysis done already, but just rooftops. And based on that, the state said, oh, well, we still need another 60,000 acres of undeveloped land. But they didn't look at parking lots. They didn't look at large turfed areas on office parks or commercial or industrial sites. So a lot more analysis needs to be done there. Then we need to identify and address some of the technical and financial and administrative barriers. So it's not only more expensive to put it on rooftops and parking lots, but there may be engineering challenges. Not all roofs can support this stuff. A lot of the larger buildings and commercial and industrial sites, they may have one owner, but then there are multiple entities that are leasing that property, and what are the implications there for legal agreements? But a lot of these things could be overcome with some serious planning effort. And that's what we'd really like the state to do. And maybe if the legislature told DOER that they had to do that, that we could get it done. So once all of that planning has been done, then if there really truly is still a gap between what we need to do to get to our renewable energy goals and what we can do within development, then maybe we can prioritize some least environmentally sensitive lands for that. But the other thing to consider here too is that there's a lot of evidence now that doing distributed energy within development sites is also, well, it might be more costly initially to build. For the overall cost of transforming our electric system, it may actually save money, because there's things like the transmission grid capacity and the way energy is distributed. If we continue building these large projects out in rural areas, we have to get that power to the demand sources somehow. Whereas if we build much more distributed, smaller projects within development sites and then pair that with storage batteries on site, then the system is more efficient. We don't need to destroy more land for new transmission lines. We don't need to spend money on upgrading the grid as much, and will be much more resilient when there are storms and other disruptions to the large grid. So there's a lot of reasons to do this, and so we really want to see the plan done and then everything realigned, and support for municipalities. Again, these municipalities need planning help. And when the state throws hundreds of millions of dollars at something like renewable energy development, they need to also put some money into funding community planning to accommodate that. And here's an example down in Long Island. Something along these lines has been done. There's an interactive map that identified the sites that are suitable for solar development. And there's also an accompanying report that looked at the barriers and identified solutions. Cape Cod Commission has also done a map, and they're working on a model bylaw and some other resources for communities. And just to put even a finer point on this, I don't know if you all heard, but just was it last week or the week before, there was a new report out from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, working together with the Intergovernmental Science Policy Forum on Ecosystem Services. IMBs, that's a mouthful, but it's the biodiversity scientists, and they all work together, 50 different scientists, and they came out with this new report, and they concluded that we need to look at climate change and biodiversity as twin crises. They're both important. We need to address them together and in ways that don't bring them into conflict. And I was particularly struck by this quote from their announcement. Sorry. This is a direct quote from their press release that said, any measures that focus too narrowly on climate change mitigation should be evaluated in terms of their overall benefits and risks, such as some renewable energies generating surges of mining activity or consuming large amounts of land. So that sounded awfully familiar to me when I read it. And lastly, I'm just going to end on more of a positive note. So we have a lot of opportunities in this region. I mentioned earlier that we need to do more than just conserve what we have left. We need to do restoration. And cranberry bogs are a great opportunity for that. The industry is in trouble. There was a legislative commission a few years ago that tried to figure out how to prop them up. You know, there's some role for that, but some of these are just not going to be viable businesses anymore. And those landowners are going to look for other things to do with their land. And so is that going to be solar or housing development, or could we increase the pace of conservation and recognizing these lands for the value that they have and restoring them to what they used to be before the cranberry bog industry was developed and altered so many of our natural wetlands in this part of the state? So you may have heard about the Tidmarsh project that Mass Audubon did. There are a number of other cranberry bog restoration projects underway. The Division of Ecological Restoration has a whole program they're developing on cranberry bog restoration. This particular one at Tidmarsh, it's hundreds of acres. It's the largest freshwater wetland restoration project in the Northeast. We're restoring Atlantic white cedar swamp and a bunch of other habitats there. And I'm just going to quickly run through some pictures to show you what's possible. So we've removed 9 dams and dikes, structures that held the water back. This is one of them. There's a reservoir in 2010. That's what it looked like when it was drained. Okay, that looks horrible, right? You've got this mud flat there, but it does not take long for nature to come back. This is less than a year later, just one growing season. And what we found with these projects is that particularly in the bogs, whether it's an impoundment with dam removal, this happened also on other dam removal projects, is typically a very strong seed bank there, even when the dam has been in place 100 years or more. You tend to have a very strong native seed bank, and these sites will revegetate. We do also some replanting within the bogs themselves in the areas that are dug up for restoration. So in some places we have to do excavation like this because there's been, tons of sand put up on top of what used to be a natural wetland bog, and that all needs to be removed. You do a ground penetrating radar, you figure out where the natural flows are, where the streams used to be, and then dig all that out, recreate the channels, recreate some micro topography, and do some planting and placement of logs and other restoration. So it looks a little messy immediately afterwards, but then again, 1 year later, boom, this is what you get. And it's just amazing. I want to read to you, just in the last few years since Tidmarsh was restored, we've created 3.5 miles of natural stream channel. We've reconnected the streams to the ocean, so the herring can now come up in, and they did almost immediately. There's over 600 species of plants, 200 species of birds, 400 butterflies, 25 dragonflies and damselflies, and 15 reptiles and amphibians. It's all from a monoculture cranberry bog that had been there well over 100 years. That used to look like this. So this is just one site. There's a lot of potential to do this at other sites. Probably 3,000 acres of land is low-hanging fruit for possibility. A lot of these landowners actually, it has been in the family for multiple generations. And they do care about the land, but they're under tremendous financial pressures. And when the solar developers come knocking with millions in their pocket, it's hard to turn that down when you don't have another alternative. So we need to ramp up funding for these restoration and conservation projects, and and build a ecosystem based tourism economy for the region. Do some limited amount of housing development on the least sensitive portions of some of these sites. There's a mix of things that could be done. And lastly, I just have a few slides on kind of cheerleading how to be an advocate for all of this. This again. So what can we do with advocacy? It can be at the state level to pass a law, or it can be at the local level on bylaws and regulations, or even planning, or just getting people more organized locally, giving people a voice. Government is run by those who show up. So bridging the gap between individuals feeling helpless and frustrated and really organizing together, how to get that message to local officials and politicians, help them understand really where you're coming from and all the things that I was talking about, why these lands are so valuable and should be valued and appreciated. And that could be at the state, it could be the town, it could be, you know, other venues like schools. You know, kids have been a really transformative force in climate action and historically on things like recycling. And so that's another venue for all of this. And in doing local advocacy, it's really important to at least try to establish relationships with folks, and whether it's your local official or your state legislator, just introduce yourself. Most legislators have district time, or they will again soon. You know, try to find opportunities to meet people, to talk with them, or if you have to do it virtually, find some way to introduce yourself. Ask them, you know, let them know what you care about and why you think something is special and deserves attention. And if they're not receptive, you know, think about, is there somebody else that they know who they might listen to more than they listen to you? Or if it's really just hopeless, maybe organize with other people to get somebody else to run for that office. That's been successful in a number of communities. Like I say, government is run by those who show up. So find people who care and have them show up and get elected. Or join a board yourself and attend the public meetings and speak up, submit comments. Stay in touch, follow the news. The coalition is doing a good job of posting stuff on your Facebook page, but just even within your community, you know, check your local town's webpage regularly and participate. Write letters to the editor in your local newspaper. Organize on social media. So just to sum up, there's a lot of value to nature, working with nature and nature-based solutions to climate and to our biodiversity crisis. Open space protection is a key to that, but also better planning for development and public participation is so important. And I'll just leave you with this quote from Losing Ground. There are many pathways forward, and so the decisions we're making today are going to influence the future in profound ways, and we need to act now. So I think I'll end there, and happy to answer any other questions, take any other feedback that you might have.